Thank you for coming out today. One of the things about the weather, if you're watching online and you're not in Florida, we've got something. I don't know if it's a storm, a front. It's not a hurricane, but it's a lot of rain. And I mentioned this morning, if I wasn't preaching, I'd be watching on the couch. Because I love that our virtual church, we can do that, and we have people from all over. So thank you for joining us there, but thank you if you're out and you made it in the room, and glad you're here this morning, and the connection is a beautiful thing, so we're glad you're here for part of that. Almost a decade ago, one of my favorite preachers, Andy Stanley, preached a sermon called The Separation of Church and Hate. And hundreds of preachers have grabbed that clever title in the last decade and used it. And over the last month or two, that has just been in my mind, and just felt with all that's going on, maybe there's a word we need to hear from that. It's been a year, hasn't it? With everything that's happened with COVID, and then the 30-week spring break that we had. That just ended, and then school, virtual school, connect school, no school, homeschool, mask, no mask, separate, don't separate, open, don't open, and then throw the election on top of that. And one of my concerns is, in the middle of all that, it has created kind of the perfect storm for Satan, I think, to slip in. And I see things coming from us, believers, that shouldn't come from us. And underlying all of the things we're dealing with, I see this little bit of anger, and this little bit of snippiness, and this little bit of hate. So this morning is not a political sermon. I have said, I don't like to use the word never, but I've said I don't think that's what a pulpit is for, politics. One, I know I could never be Republican enough for some Republicans. I can never be Democrat enough for some Democrats. I can never be loud enough, angry enough, or, have the right issues for some of you that are part of our church. So that's not what this is for. But what this pulpit is for is to remind us of what God's word calls us to, that is above politics and above national interest. So I want to do that this morning the best I can. And before you start texting me or emailing me, I don't need a reminder. I believe in voting. I love our country. I think you should vote your morals. You should vote as you feel God calling you to. But I have to tell you, God doesn't have a party. And I have some mentor Christian, I wish I had half of their faith, friends who are Joe fans. And I've got mentors, Christian people of strong faith that I envy that are Trump fans. And before you say, yes, but, that's kind of the response these days, isn't it? Somebody says, well, I'm thinking this, and we don't even listen. All he goes, yes, but what about this? Yes, but what about that? So if you can hold your yes, buts for a few minutes, and for us to maybe look at an underlying thing that maybe God is calling us to, regardless of that, of your party, or of your passions, then I think that's my goal this morning. James was not a believer in Jesus. The brother of Jesus was not a believer while Jesus was on earth. After Jesus dies and goes back to heaven, his brother James becomes not only a follower, but a leader in the church. And in the first chapter, he says this: you must all be, if you're with somebody, turn to him and say, he's talking about me. Yeah, he's talking about me, not you. You must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Human anger does not produce the righteousness God desires. Verse 22, but don't just listen to God's word. You have to do what it says. Verse 26, if you claim to be religious but don't control your tongue, you're fooling yourself, and your religion is worthless. Jesus and his disciples never took a stand against culture or government. They took a stand against some religious leaders, but they never attacked what was going on in culture or what was going on in government. And so the overriding theme, if I can get you to remember one thing, and this is the thing that rang to me from Andy Stanley's sermon, is that we have to be more intent on making a difference than making a point. And yet, I think with all that's gone on in our culture in the last 8 months, we have become big proponents of making a point and not so much about making a difference. And so I just want us to get to where that's the question we ask before we text, before we hit send, before we hit share, before we say something. Am I making a difference, trying to make a difference, or am I trying to make a point? It's always easier to make a point. If you're a parent, you know this, because we all abuse this. At some point, we set one of our kids down and say, sit there, be quiet, look at me. Don't speak. Look at me. Say you're sorry. Now go to your room. Now, we made a point where we probably didn't make a change in behavior. We probably didn't make a difference. And a lot of us have gotten really good at making a point, but it's not making a difference in our culture or in our lives. And so I want us to look at some ways that the early church made a difference, and maybe we can copy. If you remember the church, Jesus goes back to heaven. The church starts on the day of Pentecost. It begins to grow, and then persecution comes, and the church scatters. And they're all over the Roman Empire, and yet in the first 300 years, just 300 years after that, Rome, one of the greatest powers and governments of all time, is Christian. They didn't have a party. The Christians didn't have a platform. They didn't have money. They didn't have a candidate, but they changed the world. And I just want us to look at some ways they did that and the platform that they lived by. Jesus gave us the platform that we should live by above all other platforms. Whatever else we believe in, the platform Jesus gave us in his first public speech in Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, okay, guys, got his disciples, went up on the mountain. He said, here's how we're going to live. This is our platform. We're going to have the proper spirit, and we're going to be sorry about our sin, and we're going to walk in meekness, and our greatest appetite is going to be righteousness. And we are going to be merciful people, and we're going to be pure in heart, and we're going to be peacemakers. That's the platform. What will happen? We will be salt and light, and we will change the world. But those things have to happen. Pull out any one of them, and none of the rest work. That is our platform, and above whatever else you live, whatever country you live in, whatever period of time you live in, if that's the platform we live by, then we will make a difference, and people's lives will be changed. So how do they do that? Number one, they leaned toward people relationally that disagreed with them. The early Christians, when someone disagreed with them, they still leaned toward them. Jesus did this. Jesus and the disciples were a great example of this. Paul in Acts 17 goes to Athens, and he's walking through, and Acts 17 says he was deeply troubled by the pagan worship. So he went home and he made some signs that said, you're going to hell, God hates idol worship. And he walked. No, that's not what he did. He leaned toward people that he disagreed with, and he got a chance to speak, and he said, I see that you guys are really religious, and that you've even got an idol to an unknown God. Hey, I know who it is. He's not unknown anymore. Let me tell you about him. But if you look at our culture today, what do we do when we disagree with a lifestyle or a choice or something that somebody makes? Man, we separate ourselves from that. And so we get in our own little group that believes like we do, and we don't have conversation. We don't lean toward them. We don't in any way lean toward people that disagree with us. Historians say that, and these are secular historians, not Christian historians, that say in the first 300 years after the church, there were 3 major plagues. Some say 4, but 3 definite major pandemic, kill a lot of people plagues that happened in the Roman Empire. One historian says they were hauling 5,000 bodies a day out of one of the major cities. They also say that during that time, when a plague would hit, the first people to leave were the rich people. They had the wherewithal, they'd leave town. Said the next group to leave were the false priests with their idols, and they would leave town. And the people that stayed were the poor people and the Christians. And they referred to them, one historian referred to them as Galileans, and he said, it's amazing that the Galileans, the Christians, not only take care of themselves, but they have taken care of the people that the false priests are supposed to be taking care of. And they changed people because they leaned toward people that disagreed with them. They didn't go, well, they don't think like us, so we don't have to help them. They don't think like us. In fact, they're pagan worshipers. They're going to go to hell. We don't want to be nice to them. They leaned toward people. Jesus constantly leaned toward people. He didn't judge them. He didn't say, well, it's like they don't think like I do, so I can't be around them. He leaned toward people that would have disagreed with him, but he was kind to them. And he leaned in. Rome was made great again, not by a politician or not by a person, not by an emperor, but by Christians who had no power, but the power of love and living out Jesus' platform. Second thing they did, they saw that being kind was more important than proving they were right. This is tough, isn't it? You don't know how many edits today just to get to what I'm sharing with you this morning. Man, I had so many buttons that I like pushing, and we're all like that, And I know some of you, and something you didn't know that happens also supernaturally. It's a gift that God has given me that while I'm preaching, little bubbles come up above your head and tell me what you're thinking. And sometimes I see it just by the look on your face, and the evil side of me just wants to push a button to make that worse, And so, man, I'm going through striking out stuff, and the guys who are following along are going, wait, he skipped right over that section. There was even some stuff there that I just know that there's some stuff I shouldn't say because it was just put in there to push a button. We like that. The early Christians saw that being kind was more important than proving they were right. Frederick Buechner said, although kindness is not the same thing as holiness, it's awful close. And some of you right now, the bubble over your head is saying you can't compromise the truth, can't compromise the truth. Jesus never compromised his truth by being kind to people that disagreed with him. You don't have to, but we I'll be kind to them, but I want to make sure they know what they did wrong. I want to make sure they know what I disagree with. I want to make sure they know what I believe in before I can step alongside them and be kind to them. And the early Christians made a difference because they chose to be kind. Even more important than being right. Richard Rohr, he's a Franciscan friar, and he wrote a book called Falling Upward. And in that book, he talks about there are two stages of life. The first stage of life is when we determine our morals, we race gray, we want everything black and white. We determine what's right, and we decide that in our lives. He said the second half of life, which many people never get to, it has nothing to do with age, is when we decide that being kind is more important than being right. Jesus calls us to be kind. And in all that we've been through in the last 8 months, I think something that would speak into our world, into our culture, into America right now, into our neighborhoods, into our families, we're being more concerned about being kind than proving that we're right. Colossians, the 4th chapter, 6th verse says this. 5th verse, start with 5th verse. Live wisely among those who are not believers and make the most of every opportunity. Verse 6 says, let your conversation be gracious and attractive so that you'll have the right response for everyone. Some translations say gracious and seasoned with salt. Now, some of you need to back off on the salt shaker, okay? Some of you think your conversation should all be salt, and nothing's good if all you do is pour salt on it. He says, let your conversation be gracious with a little bit of salt. And we'd begin to make a difference if we could start to do that. The third thing they did is they understood that faith will destroy fear. I think the reason for a lot of our anger and our angst and all that's going on is there's just an underlying fear. I mean, I have it. I've had a cold this week. What am I afraid I have? Well, yeah, and what are you afraid I have? Some of you come in this morning and go, why do you have a mask on? I said, well, I've had a sore throat and I've been sneezing a little bit. I don't want you near me, so I've had my mask on, and it's like there's this fear, and Linda, I'm having should I do something different? There's this fear underlying everything. There's this fear about election. There's this fear about I don't think God's on his throne shaking in fear about anything we're dealing with right now. I don't think God's worried about the election. I don't think, this is just me personally, I don't think God cares who our president is. Because if you say he's God's man, God's in charge of what happens in this world. Every person that's ever been our president or ever will be our president is God's man. And God uses some people to correct and some people to discipline and some people to lead. And again, I'm not saying don't vote. I think we have a responsibility and a gift to do that. But God's man is whoever after November ends up in the White House, because God will either use him to discipline us or to lead us or to correct us in some way. But we don't have to be afraid. God's not going, oh no, the churches are closing because there's a virus. There's no fear there. In Mark 4, Jesus is in the boat in that storm, and he gets up and his disciples are all panicked because of a storm after they've just seen amazing miracles. And he goes, do you still not have any faith? Why are you so afraid of something like this if you can get the big picture of who I am? Things that happen in the culture and things that happen in the world would not give you fear. You wouldn't be afraid. I think we're afraid sometimes, and our fear shows itself in our anger, because it's easier to be angry than to be kind. It's easier for me to send off a quick response or share or something than it is to really think something through and be kind and to trust God in what he's doing. Number 4, those early Christians made a difference because they understood that getting closer to people got people closer to God. Let me say that again. Getting closer to people gets people closer to God. There's a book I wish every one of you would buy and read. It's by Sarah Bauer Anderson. Her dad, Gary Bauer, ran for the Republican ticket back in 1999. And for president, he was one of the pretty guys running for president, and he didn't make it on. But her family is full of politicians and pastors. And she said, you want to make for good conversation? You know, the two things you're not supposed to talk about, and they all aren't of the same faith base or the same party. But she takes that family example and talks about her family refused to allow space to develop between them, which is what we all do. We put space between people that disagree with us. It's a great book on how we as Christians should be responding. But in that, she tells about a Jewish tradition that everyone is born with a rope attached to God. And that when we sin, the rope is cut in two. And yet God meticulously comes after us and he wants to tie a knot in the rope. But what happens when you take a rope that's been cut in two and you tie a knot in it? It gets shorter. And so it draws us closer to God. And in the same way, the people that we have separated ourselves from because they don't think like us, they don't look like us, they don't agree with us, they don't vote like us, whatever it is, if we would begin to try to tie some ropes, we would maybe be able to get closer to them, because we will never get them closer to God if we don't get closer to them. And until we understand that there is a mission higher than our party, if there's a mission higher than the virus, there's a mission higher than my attitude, there's a mission higher than my opinion, and it's to make disciples. I cannot make disciples until I get close to people. And I cannot make disciples if I separate myself from people. So that rope that draws closer, not only to us to God, but to other people. So Galatians 3, he's talking and he says, all who have been united with Christ in baptism have put on Christ like putting on new clothes. There's no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, for you're all one in Christ. Paul's not saying, there are no longer categories. There's categories. Because you become a Christian doesn't mean now you're not a male, you're not a female. What he's saying, we don't look through that lens anymore. And the same should be true on everything that we're dealing with in our country. We see everybody as somebody that God loves and wants to draw closer to them, and maybe he's going to use us in some way to do that. So let me give you a few suggestions, okay? Five quick suggestions. Longest sermon I preached since March. Number 1, slow down. Slow down. Be quick to listen. Some of you need to get off Facebook for a month or longer. Some of you need to quit sharing. Ask this before you share something. Well, this is a point in a minute, but man, number 2, process the rules. Remember the rules we learned? This will apply what I was going to say. We used to say, well, if it's not true, if it's not helpful, Ephesians 4:29, we talked about a few weeks ago. I changed one of them that if it's personal, deal with it personally. I love this week when I sent out an email or a Facebook thing that said, hey, this week I'm preaching on separation of church and state. I spelled separation wrong. A dear friend of mine that I went to school with said, check my PM, my private message. I checked it. She goes, you spelled separation wrong. Thought you want to fix it. She could have called me out and said, you can't even spell separation right. She could have done it, the way some of you do, just publicly in front of everybody. You're an idiot, you can't spell. But she, if it's personal, deal with it personal. You don't need to deal with it in front of everybody else. And if it's loving, process the rules. If it's not loving, don't say it, don't post it, don't think it. Number 3, lean in with questions. Man, I have forced myself to do this the last couple of weeks, just to lean in with questions. I have some dear friends, again, who think differently than I do when it comes to our government and things. And so rather than us throwing back and forth how each other is wrong, I went to one of them a couple of weeks ago and I said, listen, I'll do this if you will. Would you carefully write out all the things that are important to you as why you think the way you think? And I'll do the same thing and let's talk about them without trashing the other side. That takes work. Most of us only boost up what we think by trashing what we don't think. You know, we can't have an intelligent dialogue about what we believe and what we think. All we know how to do is trash what the people that disagree with us say. But we begin to lean in, and it was amazing the things I've learned, and the relationship was strengthened because we just leaned in and asked questions. Just leaned in and said, help me understand. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me why you would do this. Tell me what your thoughts are there. Number 4, make we more important than me. Again, this is just make a difference, not a point. It is more important that you and I are friends than that you and I vote the same. Way more important that we're on the same team honoring God than that we're on the same team in some kind of government situation. Number 5, ask more and answer less. I haven't had a chance to explore this yet, so all of my people that love to fact check me, you can do that because I didn't take the time. But I read someplace this week that Jesus in the Bible, if we look, he was asked 200 questions. He answered 3. Because he knew the questions were divisive, but he told stories because he wanted the relationship to be developed. We don't have to answer every question. We don't have to answer everything somebody sends us. We don't have to answer everything that somebody sends us that ticks us off and makes us angry. Sometimes maybe it's more important to have the relationship. I love that we're passionate about stuff in our country. I love that we're passionate about our country and the freedoms that we have and all the gifts that we have and all the things that we get to do. And again, I'm passionate about there's an election coming up and we still get to vote and it matters. What matters more is that every day I get up and I honor God. And the platform of Jesus is the platform that I say I'm going to live by. That I will have the proper spirit today and I will be sorrowful about my sin and I will walk meekly and I will pursue righteousness above all other things and I will show mercy and I will be pure in heart and I'll be a peacemaker. Because then maybe I'll be able to season someone's life. Maybe I'll be able to be light in a dark place and then people will see God. Passion's great. Just make sure our passion honors God.